You're listening to the Liberty Beacon Radio Network.
This is Off-Planet Radio.
Yes, indeed it is. It's Off-Planet Radio Live. I'm Randy Moggins. It is the 17th of October in the year 2014. Sometime in your future or in somebody else's past, I'm not sure. It is a very, very, very strange period of time that we're in. This is being broadcast on the Liberty Beacon Network, tlbtowncrier.com. or tlbmedia.us are the websites where you can hear the streaming audio for the new network. And it's been said lately to me that I seem to have moved away from my normal paranormal. What kind of concept is that? My normal paranormal. I've moved away from that. Well, I'm finding it very hard now to even begin to replicate the type of lunacy that could mirror reality in three-dimensional space-time. The last few weeks, we have just been in an incredible spin cycle in terms of events that are going on around the world, and they become more surreal as we immerse ourselves into it. The reality stream itself almost seems like a funhouse mirror. And to that end, it's appropriate that we launch this network in a Mercury retrograde, by the way, which I'm told, I don't have validation of this because I'm not an astrologically inclined person, but there are people around me who swear to God that this is the Mercury retrograde from hell. It's actually a 7-year cycle that, it fell in a period following a blood moon and an eclipse, and there's just lots of weird things, and there's a lot of people who adhere to the idea that our universe, our galaxy, our planet, and the things that spin around us are somehow mechanisms that I won't say govern, but let's say affect the reality stream around us. So it gets more surreal, and there's so much going on in the world. I wanted to do a show. I wanted to do an off-planet radio show, and I wanted to launch it in a way appropriate to the new network because this is a freedom and liberty type network. The goal here is to put out information that's meaningful to the liberation of the people and to get out the word and the warning. And I couldn't think of a better group of people to be with right now. I'm breaking my exile. I've been walking in the desert for a long time now by myself, and I think my tribes are assembling around me, and I think the people are coming together, and one of those people who is coming together with me is somebody I'm going to bring up here in a minute. As we launch out on the Liberty Beacon Network, there are people behind the scenes who work very hard to make things happen. And we give a shout out to those people who have worked behind the scenes. You know who you are. We want to thank Roger Landry at thelibertybeacon.com for providing us with the inspiration to do this. And I want to bring up now somebody who is my close coworker. He is the host of the Ochelli Effect on UCY TV. I've been a guest on his show, and tonight we welcome him, Off Planet. Good evening and welcome, Charles Ochelli.
Well, good evening, Randy. Your words are just. I am spellbound by your way of speaking. I got to tell you that it's amazing to listen to you just kind of introduce things and set the mood here tonight. So thank you for having me tonight. I really appreciate it.
I don't even remember what the hell I said. I just know that it's coming from a place right now of what I have to define it as perplexed. I truly have a sense right now that most people don't know what's going on. We're having things thrown at us fast and hard. So the narrative that we inject into this tonight will hopefully be one of sanity and illumination of the course of events.
Well, it's difficult to get to a point that you could identify as sanity in the atmosphere as it is, because it does seem to me to be an extremely transitional time period, regardless of what people say from an astrological standpoint, etc. Everything seems to be very much in flux. I mean, some people point to the fact that we're going to have this larger solar eclipse later on this month.
Yep.
Which seems to be a significant event, depending on who it is you speak to. But no one that I speak to at all, regardless of their level of awareness, let's just say, about the universe in general, seems to have anything other in their minds than the idea that we are definitely in a pivotal point where things are going to turn. Now, there are those of us that think that this is the great sort of opportunity for all of us to change the tide, as it were, in this living sphere that we all enjoy. There are others who believe that it's a very detrimental and dangerous time. And here's the thing: I don't argue with either side of that equation. I think that both of them are quite correct.
And I do too. And that's the interesting thing about this, Chuck. It is a paradox, because on the one hand, it appears as though, it looks to me like when we talk about I hate the phrase "the powers that be." I don't like Illuminati because they're not illuminated. So I've chosen to follow the map and call them the Cabal. And I've said for a long time that they're not succeeding in getting things off the ground the way they used to. If they're capable of being lethal now, I would say that their spear is somewhat blunted. That doesn't mean they're any less deadly and destructive, but it does mean that the awareness level on some scale has gone up just enough to create havoc in their otherwise ill-conceived plans to deceive and dupe billions of people on the planet. If you look at what's going on in the internet and how quickly now things can be exposed by bloggers, videographers on YouTube, and people that are doing new media, you begin to see that we're up to speed now. And we're actually, in a lot of cases, completely trumping the major networks who never get it, who are reading scripts given to them by their intelligence agency handlers. So on that level, there's a lot of positive energy. On the other side of it, the scale of this is so huge when you begin to look at what is basically an international racketeering and organized crime scheme by the richest, most empowered and privileged people on the planet. I'm actually staggered sometimes by the scale of it, that men are capable of mounting offensives in countries that you and I have never been in. We don't speak their languages. We don't know their cultures. That they are able to use the machinations to bring about large-scale infectious disease attacks on the population, that they're able to game the money system globally in a way that it appears that we have prosperity, we don't have prosperity. The scale of that still boggles my mind. And I know that you, Chuck, you've been in a waking up process yourself for a long time, because you actually started what I consider to be ground zero for my life, which was the JFK assassination. How do you scale from something like Dallas 1963 to Dallas 2014, where we have this surreal scenario playing out with Ebola and flying victims around the country, and just an incredible ruse that's being played out in the media right now to do what I believe is create a pretext for nothing less than FEMA camps and locking down the population?
Well, see, that's the remarkable thing, because to me, this is exactly why my waking up process went the way it did. When you look at the scale of what occurred there, on November 22nd, 1963, and you compare it to the operations that are in effect at this point. At that point in time, the agencies had a foothold, let's just say, in the major media. They definitely had a foothold in publishing, but now as things have progressed over time, they have pretty much taken control of everything by use of the corporate entity. And this is something that you don't discover just overnight. This is why my process of awakening has taken some time, because it is so immense, so elaborate, what has been constructed, that it is entirely overwhelming. And I don't blame you for feeling completely overwhelmed, because I do on some days. It seems as though the whole world is their casino, as it were. And all there are different tables and different colored chips, but it's all the same games. This is the way I look at it anyway at this point. And but I do mark that time period, that day, in fact, as the day that our system of government was subverted for the final time. I mean, obviously, we could look at earlier markers like the institution of the Federal Reserve, the actions that took place, post Civil War in this country, and we can say that this was the beginning of the demise, let's just say, of what was the American concept. But for me to understand it in modern times, I really do mark it from that date. And I find it interesting that that's where I grew from, because there are many people that are involved in that type of research and everything that are still quite fooled by the old shell game, that are still playing the red and blue shirt game, with everything in their lives. And no matter how much they've discovered about the systems by which we're deceived, especially when it comes to the media and the mechanisms and the people that are really pulling the strings behind it, it's very strange to me to not logically go on even further, sort of evolve from that center concept and see that the entire world has been staged this way. So when I look at something like the Ebola crisis as it is at this point, it seems to me more like a staged event, which is meant to control the population first. I don't think this is the major biological threat that's going to wipe out masses of the population. I really do feel like it is just the escalation from the earlier things that we dealt with, like the bird flu, like the swine flu, like the propaganda that surrounded HIV, in the 80s, and AIDS, in fact, which was originally called GRID, when you dealt with it in the public domain. And I see it as just the escalation, the evolution, as it were, of the very same type, almost mockingbird-like control, which has been, ubiquitous throughout the entire system of media that has been erected by the so-called journalists, which I don't believe there are any journalists anymore in the mainstream. But I'm sure you understand what I'm saying.
Well, and really, can we just get over this thing? Journalism is a contrivance as well. I mean, we had newspaper men early in the history of this country. We had the town crier. How appropriate that we would talk about that. We had pamphleteers. We had writers who were using the press at that time to spread the written word. Probably up until the period of time of Horace Greeley, we really didn't have a formal state of journalism. Somebody will probably correct me on that, because there clearly were journals and gazettes and different things, but journalism was contrived. The rules of journalism were basically set up to create a system, and I know this because I studied journalism, and I understand the rules as they were laid down in terms of verifying sources, trying to have more than one source, sticking to your facts. That was always bogus, because written between the lines of every article I've ever read is an agenda. And the agenda is usually dictated top down from an editorial department who decides what news gets published. I mean, if you just look at the major newspapers in the country, and they're down to a half dozen right now in major cities, and each city now only has one newspaper, whereas back in, I live in the state capital of Pennsylvania. I remember when this town supported 3 newspapers, when it supported 2 newspapers. Now it has a half a newspaper that publishes 3 days a week, and other than that, it's got an online website like everybody else. But journalism itself, it kind of masks the idea behind it that it was controlled media, that from the very beginning, and certainly in the 20th century, it's been an organ of propaganda. It was well funded. If you look at William Randolph Hearst, if you look at the Oakes family that owns the New York Times, the people behind the Washington Post, the major newspapers were always controlled by those who were serving the elites.
Well, yeah, this is true, but it also it did allow outlets for some other people,
absolutely, yeah,
which were speaking honestly, which were speaking to the truth. And you're right, they have been editorially closed out over time. And yeah, definitely, Pennsylvania is an interesting example for sure. You have very few independent newspapers left in that entire state at this point. There's even this sort of guise of a paper newspaper that goes around the state, which they just changed the bannerhead, which I happen to know about because I used to live in the next state over. Yeah. But it was the very same newspaper, just with a different cover sheet on it. And this was going on years and years ago, even before the internet came around and started putting them out of business. But it is absolutely true. But at the same time, there was still the opportunity for other people to be published, which had different ideas. The freedom of the press really didn't reside to me with the major market newspapers or anything like that. It resided with the independent publication and people's desire to search for knowledge and to search for that which was, let's just say, not being reported in those major newspapers. I mean, throughout the 20th century, we see a lot of, pamphleteering and stuff like that, and it is very appropriate that you bring up the town crier, because, but even at that time, if you think about it, the town crier was appointed, generally speaking. He was appointed by those who were in power. So there was always some sort of overall control. The great thing about what's going on the internet still, and they're trying to figure out a way to quash, is that the concept of the independent publication is still viable. You may have difficulty competing with the larger ones, but you're able to, if you have just a very little bit of knowledge and and some relatively inexpensive hardware at this point, be able to publish whatever you wish. That's led to a lot of very bad publications. It's led to a lot of very valuable ones as well. But so everything seems to be like a double-edged sword in a way, you know what I mean, over time. And the Internet is no exception. But it is a remarkable time to live in, where we have the opportunity still to speak independently until they figure out a way to completely limit that, And I think it serves the mainstream organs out there that were the hard copy presses and things, serves them right, actually, to be pretty much going out of business and having to now come into the same realm which all of us independents are. So in a way I see it as a victory, but in another way it's just the ebb and flow of information as it goes. Like I say, at the time you could print your pamphlets and things, you could get out those ideas which were not necessarily part of the official zeitgeist, as it were, that most of the general public was accepting. But we still have that ability even in the electronic age. So, there are parallels there.
I tend to wonder sometimes if we could go back now to analog diffusion of information again. I mean, what happens if we have a massive EMP? What happens if the grid gets taken down? Do we go back to the Stone Age? Do we have some semblance of technology? And I've kind of envisioned that scenario from the standpoint of remembering back my earliest roots in doing what we're doing now. Goes back to me circulating hand-drawn comic books in 5th grade, to doing underground newspapers in the 70s, for which I was actually thrown out of school for, to doing independent radio shows and ultimately getting into shortwave and then the Internet to be able to do the kind of things we're doing today. So there's kind of a progression there. But the quantity of information now is so staggering, and the ability to diffuse that with different operators, and we know that even in the independent media there's been a lot of infiltration and dilution of the original intent. But if we go back to that analog scenario for a minute, where you had basically a single copy of something, and think back to some of the pamphlets that circulated even at the time of the country's founding, and how those things have lasted. If we went back now and we look at the digital era, how much of this that we're doing now would survive? How much going forward would survive if we went back to an analog means of distribution that was small and local and more focused on, let's say, communities and things like that?
Yeah, well, that's one of those things that comes up quite often in conversation. Among those of us that are doing this, is what would happen if this whole thing goes away tomorrow, which is a possibility. I don't know if you recall, but there were some years ago where basically the Internet went down. I forget exactly how long it lasted because I wasn't extremely involved.
I remember this.
But I know it went down for some days at least. I mean, it might have been a week, something like that. And nobody even recalls this. I can't really find mentions of it anywhere, but I'll bet you can remember it.
I vaguely do remember it, and it was early in the day. Wish I could grasp it better, but I think, well, for one thing, technically there is no Internet. Here's the dirty little secret. The Internet is a network of networks. That's the way it was originally envisioned by Werner Ving and the original people who designed this under ARPA. But it was designed to survive a nuclear attack on the United States. And from the time that it was liberated from ARPANET and started to build out in the late 80s and early 90s, it has become extremely hardened. And the robustness of it now, I have to wonder what it would take to completely decimate it, because it is able to redeploy almost on the fly. So I guess the question is it indestructible, or what kind of scenario would take it down, or does it even matter? I mean, at the point where you're talking about the kind of EMP or attack or whatever would result in this, you're talking about a situation so dire that probably none of this really matters anyway, which is exactly the reason why we're doing it now.
Well, yeah, exactly, and that's what it would come down to. It would be an interesting shift in the consciousness there too. Mm-hmm. Like we've seen a great change in the consciousness due to this construct. If it all disappeared tomorrow, again, a massive EMP type thing would also eliminate a whole lot of other more immediate problems, more immediate realities for much of the world. So this would change the whole game once again. I don't necessarily think it would be the worst thing in the world if it happened.
I don't either,
to be honest with you, because it would force people to no longer engage themselves in what I always call the surrogate reality, which as much as it sounds counterintuitive, because I love to broadcast on the internet, I love to share my ideas. I love to exchange research with people, but it almost seems like it might be healthier for the species if we did not have this sort of surrogate reality to even contend with, because then we would be forced to deal with exactly our surroundings, the greater realities of what it takes to survive. There wouldn't need to be these interjections into other people's problems. Globally, let's just say. I think it would change a whole lot of things, you know what I mean? So I sort of leave it all to fate in my mind, and don't lose any sleep over it, one way or another.
Yeah, and actually it was something that I said to Roger Landry when we broadcast on Monday night about a media fast. And I don't know how many people have embrace the concept that from time to time you need to disconnect from this grid, even if it's 3 or 4 days. I mean, I have a friend of mine who's a broadcaster out in Los Angeles who proposed this idea to me a few years ago, and his solution was basically to go off into the jungle or go out into the desert and completely disconnect from the grid, electrically, electronically, in terms of any type of extraordinary sensory contact other than what was in front of him in terms of his immediate environment. And most people now, if you look at them, are completely immersed in this, where I can't go anywhere that I don't see people completely enthralled with their devices, their phones, their tablets, their PCs, and they are completely engaged in a reality that's parallel and yet alternate to the stream that we're in. I started the show tonight talking about, the stream of consciousness, because a lot of times what I sense is that it is being altered. And, this is off-planet radio. We talk about things like time and dimensional shifts and things like that. But this is more subtle. This is occurring in the consciousness of the people. And I wonder, because we've grown up on media, we are a generation, and when I'm using this term broadly. If you're alive today, you grew up swimming in the electrosphere. It's unavoidable, because everything after the age of radio basically immersed us in an electronic sensory field that really did change the consciousness of the world. I remember my grandparents, and my grandparents were farm people. They had a TV set that got 2 channels if the weather was good, and they loved radio. Right. And they would listen to Arthur Godfrey. Gosh, I just dated myself with that, didn't I? But the idea is that we've grown up immersed in this, and we don't have a context for life without it. And yet, it seems to me like the inner spaces are where we need to explore right now in terms of where we're at right now with the events that are going on around us.
Yeah, well, this is true, and I have to take this one step further because, you and I are both mature adults. You're a touch older than I am, but either way, you're accurate about the fact that we were immersed in this electrosphere. Well, I have children, and they're growing up now in an age when they will be completely immersed if things don't collapse. They'll be completely immersed in this phase of the electrosphere, which is a little more sophisticated, a little more, all-encompassing. And that is going to be an influence on their generation, just like the television was a great influence on our generations. Radio provided a slightly different sort of way of thinking, which is why I think a lot of us embrace the use of radio now as opposed to television, because we want people to actually think about what's being said. See, when there were those old radio shows, the Arthur Godfreys, the Little Orphan Annies, any of these things, whether they were for news or entertainment, they also required the listener to become engaged in their own thought processes. They had to picture Little Orphan Annie. They had to picture the news. They had to picture what was going on.
Theater of the mind.
A theater of the mind is exactly the concept that was what it was dubbed. I was looking for a word there, sorry, but that's exactly what it was. But it actually required some thought on the listeners' behalf. They had to actually do some of their own thinking. A lot of this stuff which goes on now is actually more like thought suppressant instead of provoking it, which is it's going to be a different influence on these later generations if things continue as they have. And I think that's something that, you and I see this still relatively as a new tool. This will be just part of the reality like the telephone was to you and I. There were telephones everywhere when we were kids. A couple of generations earlier, you couldn't just pick up a telephone. We had payphones.
Well, I actually lived, this is interesting, I actually lived on the cusp of this because I grew up in a very small town. Our small town had its own telephone company, and it had an interchange. There was an office building where there was a telephone interchange that I guess moved into a trunk line that went into the city. But there was actually, I remember this when I was a little kid, my mother knew the operator by her first name, and we had party lines. Sometimes you couldn't get on the phone because you had party lines. And if you want, a private line was a big deal then. This is like, I was a little kid. And we now take for granted that we pull a phone out of our pocket. We have a private number. We have access to multiple lines on a single phone now with these mobile phones. We have grown up, again, in a completely different culture in terms of communications. Everything is much faster. Everything is multiplexed. Everything is immediate. And one of the things that I pondered a few years ago, looking at my own immersion into electronics, because I've grown up with electronics. I mean, I started out building crystal radio sets when I was a kid.
I remember those. You used to be able to go to Radio Shack.
Absolutely. That's what Radio Shack was. Yeah, I built those. I've built guitar amplifiers. I've modified electronics. I've done all kinds of stuff. I mean, computers for me never felt foreign. They felt comfortable because I understood the electronics inside. It was just the difference between crystals, then tubes, then solid state, and then the idea of putting millions of transistors on a wafer. Right. But at the same time, as this computer thing kicked in, I noticed something interesting in myself. And this is where, sometimes you got to step back and have self-awareness, introspection. My brain's speeding up. And this is not a good thing. I now understand a little bit, although I don't agree with the theory about what they call attention deficit disorder. Because you get to the point where your brain is speeding up. You're basically now spinning clock cycles. And I've said this in my shows before too, Chuck, that at one time, the smallest divisible quantum of time was the second. Well, we're now down to milliseconds and nanoseconds, and we're still slicing and dicing time, and the human brain tracks with this stuff, if not consciously, subliminally. Are you noticing in your own experience or in people around you that people are speeding up and that their attention spans are much, I'll just say they're more punctuated. I won't say they're shorter. It's punctuated attention span.
Right, that's really accurate, a punctuated attention span. What's happening in conjunction with that, the sort of exponential increase in speed that I've noticed with most people is this. The younger generation, again, I point to them, their need to remember things. They don't keep a large base of knowledge in their own heads anymore.
Oh, this is good.
Because look, they can just take out their phone and look it up.
Google it, yeah.
They Google it, right. There you go. I hate to ever even mention Google anywhere.
I know.
But you're right. That's generally what they do. They either do that or they ask Siri or whatever the hell else.
Well, that meme was planted. I mean, the idea of Googling something was planted very early. That was how Google got to preeminence in the search engine. I mean, you're not going to Yahoo something. What is that? I'm going to Yahoo something. It sounds like a hillbilly on a mountaintop.
But they did try to push it for a while.
Yeah, they did. They did.
But it wasn't as acceptable, right? Google is one of those things that sounds, sort of like something you mix up and come up with. It almost sounds like you just mixed a drink. And that is what you're doing. You're mixing the Kool-Aid because now there's no need to keep that base of knowledge. I mean, why bother memorizing, details? You can always just find them out if you just ask the computer. And to me, that is an extreme problem because you're now giving over the control of what is reality to the computer, which is a larger change than what we're talking about. We seized the computer in order to empower ourselves. It seems to me as though now it's evolving to a point where people are becoming more servile to their servers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And this is something that I don't see as a positive. And I say again, but it's the logical thing to do because as the base of information has grown, as the Wikipedias of the world have grown, why bother to keep the details? You can always look them up. But what that does is make one very susceptible to the manipulation of knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yep.
Because if you trust Google to tell you what's going on or what has happened in the past, well, now if Google changes it or Google changes their algorithm to not accept certain knowledge, and we saw this with Wikipedia, to be honest with you.
Wikipedia is a poster child for this.
Right. We learned that there was committees of gatekeepers, which it was originally promoted as something that would be edited by the people.
Yeah, it's an open source dictionary, encyclopedia.
Encyclopedia, exactly. But it could also be an open source dictionary. It could be both with no problem, right?
Right.
There used to be a word for that, but I don't remember what it is now.
A thesaurus. No, a
thesaurus tells you different words for the same thing.
That's true.
Yeah. But you know what? Wikipedia could do that for you too. No problem. But here's the thing. When we actually discovered that it wasn't being edited, sort of just by the people and at random, that there were gatekeepers in charge of that, that's the very early sort of hint of what's going on here. So now Google, if they control what comes up in their searches, then they can control the point of view of history. They can control the point of view of current events. They can control what exists, essentially, to a lot of people because they don't remember in their own minds what is reality anymore. You know what I'm getting at here? I mean, I'm not articulating this exactly right.
Because even though we know that history's always been altered and rewritten, and the old saying that history is written by the victor, and that's true. Now it's being written moment by moment, bit by bit, sometimes right in front of our very eyes, and I've literally experienced watching something being altered online. I mean, right. It's almost surreal. And we now live in the era of the electronic book. And Amazon has really staked that out. And that seems like This is difficult. I appreciate the convenience of electronic books from the standpoint that I can take my tablet, throw it in my briefcase. I can have 500 electronic books on that, just as an example, including reference books and things like that. Right. The downside to it is what happens when Amazon decides to delete, alter, or update your publications, which they totally have the right to do within their terms of service, and which they've actually done a few times. Very famous a few years ago, they actually had to go out and delete, and I'm trying to think what the book was now. I think it was 1984 by Orwell. They literally went out and deleted the book off of Kindle. And that's creepy when you stop to think that in a generation, our storage of knowledge will be in electronic formats that can be altered at just a keystroke.
Right, and then you juxtaposition that with the concept that there's no longer the value in retained knowledge, right? So that means that if they change the reality, well, there it is. It really has become quite an Orwellian concept. I mean, if they say it's reality, it is. But quite literally, and now the mechanism is in place to do it so that you can't even have someone cry out, oh no, I know that something different occurred before, or I know that something else existed before. The memory is almost strategically being extracted from an entire generation, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, this is actually amnesia by keystroke now.
That's a perfect way to codify that.
To be able to, it's so creepy because you see one of the great inconveniences in history is retrieval of text in hard format. I worked in the information field in the 90s when libraries specifically, but also law firms and corporations were beginning their digital projects, and I was selling software and hardware to do this. And one of the arguments that I made to clients was that they needed a dual system. And the dual system was basically geared towards eye-readable format, that being largely either stored printed materials or preferably film retrieval, microfiche, microfilm, largely because we know it's durable, first off. It has a life of at least 99 years based on a pretty solid scientific evidence, and also the fact that it can't be altered once it's rendered. And that was an argument that I eventually lost to certain clients who not only brought in scanners and software, but shredders with it, and proceeded to shred every document they could legally dispose of.
Well, exactly. And then where does that leave us regarding our history? Our entire history can be altered, and I find it a whole lot more worrisome. That's why I spoke to the evolution of this, because there's no longer a need to suppress a document if you can create a way to simply wipe it out of existence, if the only way that the document is rendered at this point is in the electronic form. So exactly, this is exactly what the problem is. And again, simultaneously, if you have an entire generation of people, because you and I are, our time is somewhat limited. I have a newborn son. I expect that his lifespan will be much longer than my own. At least I hope. The thing is this: when he is aware and begins to read and begins to consume information, which I hope to teach him the value of retention of information, but I may be fighting against a very large stream of influence, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, even if I do that, will I even have hard copy books to offer him? Will I have much outside of my own personal collection to offer him as all of these things disappear? So there is a bit of a difference when it comes to, and this is why, of course, we do hearken back to a lot of those older mediums like the newspaper. We still appreciate it and even romanticize it, because at the very least, once you had a newspaper in your hand, you could keep that. You could hold on to it. Nowadays,
do you know that I still have? I just found this, Chuck. It's sitting here in a box next to me because I just cleaned out a room. A very yellow, tattered newspaper of the day that Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. So, you know, these are things that are treasures in hard copy form. It's tactile, and we haven't talked about that. We haven't talked about the ability to interact with the media because we're also interacting with an electronic media that's not tactile anymore and can actually be morphed and changed in, again, a millisecond.
Well, right, and there again is another example where over time, when you have the actual the things that you can interact with in a tactile way, being destroyed, being disappeared, the story now which will be left for future generations to understand, even about that event, is going to be left up to the manipulation of what? The larger, Google entity, which still for the life of me I cannot figure how it is they have grown to be the powerhouse that they were and are,
CIA funding, to be quite honest, to refer back to a show I did the other night with on this network with David and Vinny, and an article that Veterans Today published called Monsters Among Us, written by Gordon Duff, where he just out and out exposes the fact that Google and Wikipedia were both intelligence agency brainchilds from day one.
Well, right. This is what we're discovering, and that's why I kind of threw that question out there, because I knew you'd have an answer for it. Here's the thing: is that when you look at the fact that this stuff is all being propped up and funded by these intelligence agencies, I mean, that immediately throws up a red flag for me. I was, in fact, skeptical of the Internet at first because I realized that it grew out of the ARPANET in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And I understood what the concept of the ARPANET was, in a cursory sense. And at first didn't even want to really get drawn into it, because I felt as though it was going to end up being really just a larger system of mind control, and I'm not entirely far from the mark. I mean, a lot of the interactive bases and things that are on the Internet that people participate in are the really greatest voluntary intelligence collection organs I've ever seen in my life. Mm-hmm. I mean, Facebook, which is something that, almost all of us have used at some point or other. I mean, think about the database of that thing at this point. It's entirely frightening. And again, you can find that that stuff wasn't exactly just, didn't just happen to succeed because it was a great idea. Most times they are funded and kept going for a very long time, by many hidden hands, I should say. And not just the CIA, but there are other intelligence agencies involved in all sorts of data collection, data manipulation, and that's what it's come down to.
Well, we know that MI6, the Mossad, the CIA, and any other number of, including the Vatican's and intelligence agencies, all work together. That they're aggregating data, and now with what is effectively just one step shy of quantum computing out in Utah. Here's a scenario. When I first envisioned this whole Orwellian situation of all this aggregation of information, I'm like, okay, so you've got cameras all over the place, and it's like the old saying that came from the Watchmen movie, who watches the watchers? Well, who watches us? How many people does it take to watch everybody? Well, it takes everybody to watch everybody, and then you go, oh my God, it's social media.
Well, right. And I recall back in, I think it was the 80s, they had one of these an independently produced documentary talking about how video cameras were going to be everywhere and they were going to be very small. And it was actually dead on for what it is we're dealing with now, where, you know, everybody's phone has a camera in it. You know, almost anything is a transmitter at this point in time, right? We've even discovered that, you know, the cable boxes have to interact with the cable company, and therefore they are a transmitter of information. Even further, we're discovering that, or at least this is something new to me, may not be new to you, Randy, but even your appliances in your home can now at this point be accessed to acquire information. And I mean, I'm literally talking about your newer refrigerators, your ovens, okay? They can be utilized as a data collection tool, okay? So in this electronic grid the way it is, there is nothing secret anymore. But I found it remarkable, even in the 80s, they were talking about the cameras and the fear of Big Brother, right? So the end quote of that documentary, and I can't remember the name now, but I remember watching it and thinking, you know, this is very intelligent and very well ahead of its time, I believe. They were saying that, you know, in the scenario where we fear Big Brother watching us all, the reality is that if things continue to progress as they are, we will in fact be Big Brother. We will in fact be the tools of the great watching, the great, you know, the great voyeuristic powers that be. And what it comes down to is when we look at the reality of the way things are in this age, it has come to pass. It has absolutely come to fruition.
Yeah, it's in a sense, I feel like if they are capable of deleting the past, they're also capable of rewriting the future. I mean, we don't really understand. This will go right into off-planet radio territory, but we don't really understand the continuum of consciousness a whole lot.
Right.
And there is this sense now that there are skips and blips in time, even based on certain calculations of quantum physics, that this is a very malleable thing. Our consciousness exists submersed in this data stream, our senses, and that this stuff can all be played with. And you get into the idea of future crime and what was broken out by Philip K. Dick in the, what's the movie? Was it Tom Cruise?
Minority Report.
Minority Report, thank you. That's kind of where we're headed, because now, and this does go into artificial intelligence, which to some degree I debunk because I still don't think AI the way it's envisioned is completely possible. But I do think it's possible to manipulate things to the point where you simulate artificial intelligence. You both slow down human consciousness while at the same time speeding up the machines, thus creating the same effect. There was a thought in there somewhere, but I think I lost the crux of it. So feel free to pick up the ball and run with it.
Well, it's okay, because this is very appropriate in my mind, because like I said, we now have already submitted to the great intelligence of the collective internet, let's just say. You know, if the internet were to become conscious at this point, what amount of knowledge would a single human being or even a reasonable group of human beings have over it? Would we have any amount of knowledge or possibility of competing with it? You know, and I don't debunk the idea of AI, because I do believe it's possible to simulate consciousness. But to do it to the degree where we have, an entirely independent, like a living organism, it's hard to imagine. But this is what they're striving for. I mean, you can see this stuff coming up. And to me, that's extremely frightening, because, you know, in our minds, even now, if you think about the difference of the texture of intellect between ourselves and our house pets, it's very possible in my mind for them to put together a computer that could, by contrast, be on that level of intelligence when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to anticipation, when it comes to the speed of analysis and things. And also, this does fit right in line with the idea that a lot of people share, which is that the society in general is being dumbed down.
Yeah.
So it makes perfect sense, actually.
Yeah, if you look at social networks, for instance, it may be that we have this profusion of information, but it appears as though people have become even more shallow and petty. I think back even to like the early 90s when you had flame wars on Usenet groups, and those things got horribly ugly. I mean,
oh yes, they did.
it was insane how intense that was, and you realize that we interject ourselves into whatever we're communicating through. We actually, like Marshall McLuhan said, become the media that we are utilizing. So in a sense, we're projection, and you can see it. I mean, even just the all caps letters when you're shouting someone down. But I've said for a long time, and I said this years ago, that there were times when I would get emails from people and I felt emotionally the impact of that. There was almost like an electronic subcarrier in the characters themselves. In other words, there is something else. I think it's a field effect that occurs in terms of electronic transmissions that's subliminal, that we can't quite put our fingers on, but we sense it, we feel it. So this thing actually is kind of developing its own consciousness.
Well, see, now that is an interesting argument because if you look at, even television broadcasts and how people would emotionally invest in those, which was the whole reason why they created a cliffhanger. You would wait a whole next week, because you wanted to know what happened to this person you've never met who's actually an actor, and you would suspend your disbelief so that you would emotionally invest. There's a whole lot of different levels to that. And this to me is the sort of false use of the empathic abilities of the human being.
Wow, that's good.
Characteristically, we're supposed to be, we're supposed to have empathy for our fellow man. Well, when you induce an alpha wave state and you drop that sort of defense where you don't sort of completely recognize that it's a movie and you can begin to emotionally invest because you're empathetic, because you're going to root for somebody, because you're going to experience this vicariously, et cetera, you become emotionally invested. And nowadays, I mean, even when you see people, and this is totally off subject, but also ties to it, even when you hear stories about, kids who are bullied online, who wind up taking their own lives.
Yeah, it happens too.
They're realistically doing damage to their physical selves because of a concept in their minds that they interpreted from an electronic signal. You know what I mean? And this is just the sort of logical ad absurdum, the final sort of the end result, let's just say, of what's being tuned up, and I do believe that this is increasing. Now, if you sort of put that all together, it could be seen as part of the other consciousness, but I think more or less it's really the sort of seizure of opportunity by those that produce a lot of this media to basically, grab people in a place that's not necessarily intellectual, that's not necessarily emotional, but in a very sort of base way. Because I do contend all the time that it's our natural state to be empathetic, to actually care about others, to care about our surroundings and things like that. But when you take away that barrier between what is reality and what is this other thing, which I say again is the surrogate reality, things become convoluted. especially for someone who no longer makes those same emotional investments in their physical reality. Now all of their emotions are invested in their surrogate reality, and this becomes a very dangerous thing. So back to your idea about media fasting, I would say that that this is something that should be required. This is definitely something that I would endorse fully, and I do every now and then myself. It's a little harder because we have this drive and this desire to communicate, and this has become a tool for us to do so. But every once in a while, you do need to unplug. You do need to step back and try and just simply be the human that you were meant to be, because you're a remarkable organism, and not even those who are seeking to control you fully understand the entirety of your nature. And although they've seized upon this one particular aspect to sort of draw in the population, I think that we're still at a point in time where we have that choice to either participate in it or not. So, I don't know, maybe that's just my crazy idea, but that's just how I see it.
I think that was actually a good place to leave what I consider to be a really intense and unique conversation. Again, this was kind of, we were going to talk about current events, and we did none of that to our credit. And that's actually good, because there's lots of media out there on current events, but I think what we talked about goes back into the past and trends into the future in ways that we can't imagine right now. Charles Ochelli, thanks for joining me, and I'm sure we'll be talking again on air very soon. And do you have a website or anything, Chuck?
Realistically, I just do the shows now. I don't have a website running. I'm working on it, but if you just kind of search for the Ochelli Effect, you'll find me somewhere.
And on YouTube as well.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I do have that little YouTube channel, mostly focused on the JFK assassination. But hey, thanks again, Randy.
Thanks, Chuck. Good night. This is Off Planet Radio Live. I'm Randy Moggins. The truth is out there. It's inside you. Keep looking for it. We'll be back with another show very soon.
Yeah.